I'm David Campbell Bannerman, MEP for the East of England, so we cover all of East Anglia, 5.5 million people, based out of Norwich. I was elected in 2009 and re-elected in 2014. I'm a pro-Brexit MEP, which means I actually campaigned for the end of my job. I was in government previously as a special advisor on the Northern Ireland peace process, 96-97. Been local councillor, being chairman of the Bow Group, the think tank, been involved with politics. I was chairman of UKIP and deputy leader, but I've been Conservative 24 years and UKIP 7 years.
How does your personal ideology affect your view on Brexit? So what is your overarching affiliation, usually?
Well, I'm very pro-Brexit. I campaign vigorously for Brexit. I think the choice in the referendum, in my view, is between superstate or sovereignty. It was, do you want to be in a country called Europe, or United States of Europe, or do you want to run your own country and have friendly relations, trading and other relations with the European Union? I've just come back from New Zealand. I mean, they are a sovereign, independent, democratic nation, and they want to have great trading and other relations with the EU, and I'm actually actively working on that at the moment. And what I say is, look, Britain wants to be the same, like Canada or United States, great relations with the EU, but we run our own country.
Would you describe yourself as a libertarian, or not really that?
I'm pretty moderate and easygoing. I'm quite libertarian in many ways. I think pure libertarian worries me slightly. I mean, like no control over the internet, for example. I mean, we've seen the problems with terrorism on the internet, and the implications of that are very serious. But I'm pretty liberal, and I think it's important in a society to be liberal, and I believe in freedom of speech, freedom of action, and the right of self-determination and self-expression amongst the British people.
What's your view on the eastward expansion of the European Union? Do you view it as increasing security, or
the continuing ongoing?
Yes,
You mean Serbia, etc. Well, I think it's taking in countries which are more questionable, and I mean it's meant to have common values. The European Union, there are issues with Hungary, for example, Poland going on at the moment, the European Union. I'm concerned about, for example, Ukraine. The association agreement of the EU actually spurred the crisis with Russia, caused the annexation of Crimea. I don't excuse what Russia did, but it did arise directly from the EU trying to work on defence and a common security policy with Ukraine. Right, and of course I've actually been around Crimea, and I've seen the Soviet fleet in Crimea and Sevastopol, and it's a very sensitive area, and the EU actually spurred that. So I think there are dangers in going into a number of these countries, association countries, which are basically countries too far for the EU.
What is your opinion on the government and the opposition parties' negotiating strategy for Brexit?
Well, it is. I mean, I acknowledge it's a difficult process to disengage from the European Union. But really, what are we doing? We have to replace our membership with a trade deal in particular. We are the largest single market for the rest of the EU 27. We're their largest customer, so that helps, and I think the trade deal will be quite straightforward actually once we get to that point, because we don't have any tariffs, we don't have any quotas, our laws are convergent, so we start in a very different place to the United States or Canada or India or in New Zealand, for example. But the problem at the moment is more to do with the way the EU is trying to negotiate, and particularly the demands for cash. There's a figure of about 50-60 billion pounds that seems to be plucked out the air. I think it's right that we, out of goodwill, we pay for the spending commitments we committed to 2020. I think there's a case for that. The MFF, the Multiannual Financial Framework, runs from 2014 to 2020. I think it's probably right to honour those, but there should be no further contribution apart from those programmes or agencies that we want to maintain, such as Horizon 2020, the research programme. We get a lot of money out of that. Mind you, we pay a lot of money into it. So that's important to Cambridge and the East of England, Norwich. The Erasmus student programme, the European Space Agency, the Transport Agency of the EU. There are a whole number of programmes and agencies we may wish to pay for, but you're not talking about billions, you're talking about hundreds of millions for those programmes specifically. So I think it's unreasonable to demand more. I think the opposition on that point has been totally unhelpful. I don't think they understand. They changed their policy. I've lost count. Labour is up to their 7th or 8th policy on Brexit. They want to stay in the single market, customs union. They're meant to represent and protect poor people, but if you stay in the customs union, you're in favour of 45% tariffs on New Zealand lamb. You're in favour of 60% tariffs on cheap Chinese shoes. Now, the consumer, particularly those who are pushed, on lower incomes, would benefit from cheaper food and cheaper clothes, textiles, etc., which the EU is preventing, and people don't even know this. But that is the reality of the customs union. I think it's hypocritical of Labour to take that view. And if you stay in the single market, then you're basically staying in the EU anyway, I think, in many ways, and you're accepting all of the EU's laws on the single market, which increasingly bleed into all sorts of other areas, and it's about control over our nation. So I just don't think it's credible or workable. We need a clean break. We need to be like Canada, where there's no freedom of movement. We're not paying a fee, but we have trade access, and we have a lot of political agreements with the EU.
The multi-annual framework, do you have a more reasonable figure up to 2020 that you could imagine?
Well, no, I think the principle that you honour those spending commitments to 2020 means the EU isn't disadvantaged by us leaving. There is a case for saying we don't have to pay this. The House of Lords actually said there is no legal commitment to these monies, any money actually. And you have to say, if you're paying, even £20 billion, say, that is money that we could be spending on the NHS or schools or defence, for example, which we're not because we're paying the EU. But I do think it's important to keep goodwill. We want to work together in future. We want a good trade deal, ideally. But the EU is playing this very badly, trying to say, you can't have a trade deal without signing up to money. You don't actually have to pay. Our legal experts say we don't have to pay for it. The House of Lords has said that. So there is a problem with that, and that might cause the talks to fail, the actual money side, the demands from the EU, which are unreasonable. I'm afraid the EU does not have a good record when it comes to negotiations. Otherwise, they would have done a deal with David Cameron, and arguably, he may have won the referendum, and we wouldn't be leaving. But they didn't do a deal with David Cameron. They left him in the lurch, and this is partly the consequence of that.
As your time working on Northern Ireland on the peace process, did you meet Michel Barnier? And if so, what was your view of him at the time?
No, I didn't meet Barnier. I met, obviously, a lot of the Irish people, Dick Spring, for example. He was heavily involved. John Bruton, who was their Prime Minister, the Taoiseach. And I was actually behind John Major and John Bruton when the peace talks started. What was extraordinary, for example, on the first day was that John Bruton mentioned someone had been murdered, sadly, but the person who actually murdered them was sitting right opposite, right in his eye line. That was how extraordinary it is. They'd been inside for 20 years, 25 years, and they'd been let out as part of the peace process. But it was a fascinating process. It was extraordinary. But I have to say, if you compare it with Brexit and the difficulties over the Irish border, we didn't know if we were going to get to the end of the day with the Northern Ireland peace process. It was incredibly demanding and difficult. And it was on a far different scale than actually sorting out a customs border, which many nations around the world do. For example, between the United States and Canada, where trucks don't even slow down. They've done the paperwork in advance. There are issues like that which are pretty straightforward, but the Northern Ireland process was not straightforward. Indeed, in fact, it nearly collapsed on the first day. My boss, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, was on the phone to John Major, who'd gone back to London, and it nearly collapsed by lunchtime of the first day because of a problem with George Mitchell, the US Senator. There was objections to him chairing it. But that was resolved, and we moved ahead, and it was an extraordinary process, and it saves 300, 350 lives a year is the way I look at it.
So moving on to the Court of Justice and the justice structure. And what is your view on the evolution of the powers and the scope of the Court of Justice at the European Union?
The European Court of Justice, ECJ, yeah. Well, I don't like the European Court of Justice. I think it is a court of integration. Its answer is always more Europe to any question put before it. There's the Apple tax case at the moment involving Ireland, and it basically is trying to force Ireland to accept more tax or charge more tax to Apple. And it should be a sovereign matter. Taxes shouldn't be included in the EU. But there's always this sort of creeping, like a trespass that goes on for the European Court of Justice. It's a tool of integration. It's not like I would say, a proper court. It's part of the institutions of the EU, trying to create a superstate, trying to grab more power. I'm not, I respect the judges or whatever, but the purpose of this court is to drive more and more integration. And a lot of the judgments have done exactly that. And of course, they are directly binding on the UK at the moment. This is the fundamental rights, the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Well, I think the whole issue of rights is very crowded. I call it a rights fest. We're all in favour of human rights, but actually the EU has not created any new rights. We had these rights before. A lot in Britain they go back, or England, they go back to Magna Carta, 1215, or before that, no arbitrary imprisonment, the right of fair trial, the freedom of speech. All of these are rights we have had, luckily, in the UK for centuries. Now, we incorporated those into the European Convention of Human Rights. The Convention is a good document. It was written by British lawyers to give the rest of Europe the rights that we already enjoyed. So when it comes to the Fundamental Rights Charter of the EU, these actually aren't even rights. They're really like they're social obligations, or you could call them, we might believe in them in the sense of, people should have jobs and pensions and housing. They're more like social rights, but I wouldn't call them human rights. And I don't think it's a very helpful intervention. It's over-regulation, it's over-interference. When we talk of rights, it should be those fundamental rights that we've enjoyed, fortunately, for hundreds of years, which are incorporated in the European Convention of Human Rights, and we will remain a member of the Council of Europe, the 48 nations, and the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. We have problems with the interpretation of some of that by some of those judges who are in the ECHR, but I think we should stay signed up to the convention, and that actually, as I say, is another way of supporting those rights. Finally, I would say you have this Human Rights Act, which Labour brought in 1998, which is a domestic UK Act, which sought to just force our courts, UK courts, to impose European Court of Human Rights judgments. I don't think we need a Human Rights Act. I don't think it added any human rights. We already had these. The European Convention actually just reinforces those, but we don't need the Human Rights Act on top of all of this to enforce it. That should be got rid of. We maybe need a Bill of Rights, but that's a separate debate.
On the topic of the Bill of Rights, how do you think that what form should that take? What protection should be put in?
Well, we don't have a written constitution, as well we know. One of the benefits of that, though, is you don't have this huge body of Supreme Court law that you have in the United States. As soon as you write something down, you have the limits of language, and you have to debate over the meaning of words and the interpretation of those words. And I think sometimes, you could argue when you actually look at the written Constitution of the United States and the huge amount of case law, Supreme Court law and discussion and debate, whether that's actually a very helpful way to go. We have a much more flexible Constitution. But I do think it would be good to have a debate about the Bill of Rights and what are the pluses and minuses of this. There are pluses and minuses of writing it down and interpreting it. I think Brexit will mean, by the way, the Supreme Court of the UK will become supreme. It's not supreme at the moment. It's junior to the European Court of Justice, the ECJ in many ways. It's also junior to the European Court of Human Rights in certain respects. I don't think that's acceptable. We should make it supreme again through Westminster, giving them those powers. They should take into account ECJ judgments and leave it to the judges whether that law is valid or not. They should take into account the European Court of Human Rights judgments and build that into UK Supreme Court judgments. But they shouldn't be overruled or dictated to by the Europe in its wider sense.
Right. So you are obviously opposed to EU membership. What would stop a future government from re-entering the EU in some form or another without a written constitution?
Well, it's an interesting point. I mean, I do think we need some kind of constitutional safeguard that any attempt to go back to the European Union, and I would say as a Democrat, I do think it's acceptable for certain parties or Democrats to propose returning to the European Union. I mean, you have that in Norway, for example, but it's a tiny proportion. It's only about 20% actually, or less, actually contemplate, joining the EU. But it's a valid position, but I do think you need to have some safeguarding referendum that any attempt to go back to the European Union should go to full referendum. And that must be a safeguard. I mean, we have the Referendum Act anyway, so any sort of treaty changes, for example, at the moment, it's still valid, would have to go to a referendum in Britain. You need a similar kind of device to ensure that any attempt to try and get us back through the back door into the European Union against the wishes of the British people would have to go to a referendum. I think that's a very important safeguard. Whether you need a written constitution for that, it would help potentially. I accept that. There's probably more of a safeguard if you had a Bill of Rights or a written constitution. But I do think you can enact it through Westminster legislation as we already had with the Referendum Act.
And what's your view on abrogations on the Convention on Human Rights? In 2001, it was relatively easy to abrogate with emergency secondary legislation. So what's your view on how it should take place?
Well, I think the first point that people don't appreciate is the EU is trying to sign up to the European Convention on Human Rights in its own right. Therefore, at the moment, any EU member state could actually leave the convention. But if the EU signs up to it, then it will bind all its member states. They won't have the right to leave the convention. I'm not advocating leaving the convention. I'm just saying that's a right. I'm not clear about all the opt-outs and abrogations. I mean, that's quite a very specialist area, legal area. What I do believe is that, I mean, I've had this debate actually with the German justice at the European Court of Human Rights, who was very interesting. And she fully understood, she said it was actually, as she understood the point, that it's about who makes the final decision, And I want our Supreme Court to be able to make that final decision, because that's about sovereignty, it's about, who runs your country. our judges should run our country, but they should be allowed to take into account European Court of Human Rights judgments. That's the right way around. It used to be the case some time ago, 20 years ago, that these were advisory, and that we should go back to that. They should be advisory, not binding on the Supreme Court. And then it'd be up to our judges. They may be entirely convinced that the European Court of Human Rights is absolutely right and enforce it. I mean, you have decisions like the votes for prisoners, which I think is abusive. I think it's appalling, and it's appalling. The British public think it's appalling that prisoners should be given the right. I feel that is appalling judgment from the European Court of Human Rights, and should be, frankly, only advisory and be overruled by the Supreme Court in Britain, in my view. I mean, that was one case, and also rights for terrorists. Special rights for terrorists, it making it very difficult to deport terrorists. We don't need that when we are facing 3,000 jihadists in Britain. I mean, we have a real threat. I know that, I was on the IRA death list, and I know about these kind of threats as part of the peace process. We have 3 times the amount of the IRA active jihadists out there in Britain, according to the security services. And that is very concerning, and I don't think it's necessary for these courts to get in the way, and the power must be back with our Supreme Court.
Okay. Part of the Good Friday Agreement was signing up to the Convention on Human Rights. How do you think that leaving Europe, the European Union, will affect the Good Friday Agreement, if at all?
I don't think it will affect it at all. I mean, the question I asked, and I've spoken in Dublin quite recently to the new Brexit Institute about this, obviously not in favour of Brexit, many of those in Ireland, but the point is that, who is calling for a hard border? Who is calling to undermine the Good Friday Agreement? No one is, or from whatever perspective. I mean, no Brexiteer is saying let's get rid of the Good Friday Agreement. And the Democratic Unionist Party, DUP in Northern Ireland, is very pro-Brexit, and it runs the administration, or when it's actually active. It's suspended at the moment. But I don't believe there's any threat to it. I mean, to be honest, the EU's role in the Good Friday Agreement is greatly exaggerated. It helped with some financing, which is British money, a lot of it going to the EU and coming back again, let's be honest. It did help with some financing, and it was supportive of it. But it was the British and Irish governments that work, and I was part of that process. I sat in meetings where that was going on, and I know the institutions, that worked from the Anglo-Irish Agreement onwards. And I think it's a gross exaggeration. There's no desire to go back or overturn that, and there's no reason why it should be affected by a new relationship. I mean, we have a common travel area with Ireland anyway, going back to 1923, long before the EU was ever thought of. I think we probably need a common customs area which mirrors that as a special, particularly within the island of Ireland, without compromising the UK sovereignty. But I think we could do that. That's a kind of solution we need, and that will not undermine the peace process.
How does the DUP's role in the UK Parliament, in the current government, in the Competence Supply Agreement, does that affect the Good Friday Agreement at all? Or is it not really an issue?
There's some debate about whether the UK government can be a neutral actor, in terms of the Good Friday. I understand those kind of debates. I think these are pretty academic debates. I mean, the UK does have an interest in Northern Ireland and sovereignty as part of the UK anyway. You can't get away from that. But it is signed up to the Good Friday Agreement, as is the Irish government. And I don't think it really affects that. I think it's a reality. I mean, the DUP work with Sinn Féin normally in the Northern Ireland Assembly. I've been to Northern Ireland Assembly. I've seen it in action. I met Mr. McGuinness, Martin McGuinness, who I know, his past I would not agree with at all, but he was totally committed to the peace process and making it work. And he was working very closely with the DUP, and the whole kind of Chuckle Brothers thing was quite remarkable. That is, between him, Paisley, and Martin McGuinness. You could never have envisaged that actually happening. When I was involved in the peace process, the idea they could get on so well. But it was very much an embodiment of the two traditions, which is the heart of Good Friday Agreement. Nationalists and unionists working side by side, and actually they've got more in common than they have apart. And it was a very harmonious and quite amusing relationship.
Right. But do you believe that the negotiations can conclude until the Assembly is reformed, or can it continue without?
I think it can continue without. The powers are there. I mean, I'm afraid that, you look at the historically, Stormont's come and gone quite a bit. I mean, it's better when it's there and functioning, and it binds in the communities and those that might, fall back into bad ways in terms of terrorism or whatever. It's important to do that. But no, this is really between governments, and there is an important relationship between UK and Irish government over the border and over the Good Friday Agreement and over the whole terms of Brexit, and that will continue whatever happens.
Back to the Court of Justice.
Yeah.
What role should it have in the transitional deal? How should that be handled in terms of courts?
Well, it's clear now, the Prime Minister's made it clear, the withdrawal bill will make it clear when we leave, which is, will be out the 29th of March, 2019, 11 p.m, I think it is, something like that. But that's when we leave, and if we leave then you cannot have the European Court of Justice ruling us, or any of its judgments being binding, in my view, after that point. Otherwise, you haven't left, because it's part of the institutional makeup of the EU, and you can't have a foreign court. We wouldn't like the US Supreme Court to overrule us or have any sovereignty over us if we are truly out the European Union then. So it's just not acceptable. It is a red line, and we need to be out of the ECJ, and it should not have any part in the transitional deal, in my view. I mean, the transitional deal, it depends what you're talking about, because we don't know what deal we want yet, and that hasn't been announced. But I hope the transition will be about customs agreements, the technical aspects that deliver or underpin Brexit, because you will leave the European Union, there'll be some, obviously, adjustment needed on customs, aviation agreements, data, immigration, for example. That's what the transition should be about, actually enacting the deal. And that may take, a year or 2 years, no more, in my view. I mean, the idea of anything more than 2 years is a nonsense and ridiculous, and it will not be acceptable to the British people, in my view. So we need to leave. We are going to leave 29th of March 2019. The transition is really to tidy up the more detailed aspects of leaving. That's what it should be there for, but there's some debate about this still.
The Great Repeal Bill has certain provisions that allow the amendment of primary legislation via secondary legislation. What is your view on these powers?
Well, I think my view is, I dealt with secondary legislation on the Northern Ireland when I was in Northern Ireland office, on gambling in Northern Ireland. Some secondary legislation is used, obviously, right across the field of law or parliamentary legislation to enact the bigger picture stuff. And it's more used mainly for the detail of enacting the bigger picture act. And it always has this democratic concern that you're overruling Parliament or getting round Parliament or whatever that is. It's nothing. It's exactly the same issue for the withdrawal bill as it is for most legislation, most acts of Parliament. My understanding, secondary legislation, is that if enough MPs challenge that secondary legislation, it then can be debated in Parliament and properly debated. But a lot of it is enacting a pretty detailed stuff, pretty boring stuff, dare I say, which doesn't really, the will of Parliament is established by the Act of Parliament, like the withdrawal bill. This should be for detail. I mean, I would have an objection if it's being used for very substantive issues. I don't think it should be, but this should be for the detail, some technical stuff that follows from the actual, the proper act. But as I say, the debate is very much the same for all pieces of legislation. But I don't. It's hypocritical, by the way, for Labour to object to secondary legislation in the withdrawal bill when they've been going along with secondary legislation enacting everything the EU's been doing, apart from directives which go into their own UK law. But a lot of these regulations have been directly applied, and there's been Parliament, Westminster, has not been able to overturn, I think, any of these this secondary legislation that's enacted EU law. So, where was the objection on those? I didn't hear any objection from Labour on that. I think it's a bit of a fallacy to raise it now.
Regarding the devolved legislatures, such as Scotland, the Scotland overall voted to remain. How do you view their position should be considered within the UK Parliament?
Well, like Northern Ireland voted Remain as well. I think there were underlying issues which were very important in that debate. I mean, in Scotland, the Scottish people did not want a second Scottish independence referendum. And they made that clear in the general election, by, frankly, 21 Scottish nationalist MPs, including Alex Salmond, losing their seats. There was a very strong swing against having a second independence referendum. I think that got in the way. I think Scotland's actually more supportive of Brexit than than that vote showed, because the Scots people are more concerned, and I've got a lot of friends and family in Scotland, they were more concerned about stopping a second independence referendum. But I think Brexit will actually do that, and the reason it will do it is that 2/3 of the exports of Scotland go to the rest of the UK. They will not be able, post-Brexit, Scotland, breaking off within the European Union, as a separate nation, will be far, far more difficult. They'd have to apply to be a member, like, dare I say, Catalonia would have to apply to be a member if it was free of Spain. And it would have to join the euro, and it would lose the rebate, and it would have to sign up to all sorts of things that would actually, I think, make it saleable in a second Scottish independence referendum. And Northern Ireland, again, the issues were worry about the border and the Good Friday Agreement. These were myths, I think, in many ways that were did create that majority vote in Northern Ireland as well. But what people don't realise is that obviously we'll be able to super devolve, as I call it. You'll have super devolution. We the UK will get back powers like fishing, farming, trade, energy and environment, which are mostly, some are 100% powers now with the EU, bring them back to the UK, but then devolve them down to Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. Fishing, the Scottish fishermen are 95% pro-Brexit in Scotland, because it's devastated, the common fisheries policy has devastated Scotland and devastated the UK's fishing. We had 70% of Europe's fish before we joined the EEC. We have a quota of 12% now. We'll go back to running our own fishing waters, and that'll be a huge boon to Scotland and the Scottish fishermen. And that power can be run from Scotland, as Iceland runs their own fishing regime, or Norway. And trade, well, Scottish whisky, I get involved with that on the trade side, and oil. And, Scotland's a good exporter in many ways. And having more of an input into British free trade agreements, which will be more Scottish, helpful to Scotland and Northern Ireland, which Northern Ireland has strong bonds with America. An American trade deal would benefit certainly Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. So there are some real benefits of Brexit for devolved regions.
But on the point of how we deal with the constitution post-Brexit? How much say should these regions have over constitutional changes?
I think it's a UK matter. I mean, you have to also, when you look at devolved assemblies, their powers and parliaments, their powers are devolved down from the UK Parliament. The UK Parliament gives them the power to run the Scottish Parliament, for example. You know, the power actually comes from the UK. So I think constitutionally it's important that the UK deals with Brexit. As I say, these super devolved powers should come to those devolved bodies, but it's a UK matter, Brexit. I mean, I know there's a debate about whether the Scottish Parliament can block aspects of it. I mean, I think that would cause huge resentment. It would be a very bad move, and I don't think it's constitutionally valid, you know. I really don't. So, but let's get on with Brexit, and let's ensure that the benefits of Brexit through this super devolution actually do get down to the Scottish Parliament, the Northern Ireland Assembly and the Welsh Assembly.
The Court of Justice, obviously you said that you don't think it should apply, but how should cases currently going through the court be dealt with after Brexit? Should they just be advisory?
Well, that is a moot point, and it has come up in the withdrawal agreements. There's been papers, British government papers on the position. I mean, again, it seems to me, if you were to say that, you know, there's the guillotine drops and any case going through will no longer apply, then I think that'd be unfair on those parties. But if you're going to take into account ECJ judgments in the Supreme Court or British courts anyway, then it's resolved through that. You know, the courts are then, you know, you just have to work through a different court system, the British court system, but taking into account the arguments and resolve it that way. I think that's a fair way forward and a pragmatic way forward.
What role should the EU play within NATO in terms of a defence force?
I'm very worried about what the EU is up to, and I am worried that Britain could sacrifice its independent defence policy as part of negotiations. That'd be totally wrong, and I'm getting information. The EU wants to go full steam ahead towards an EU army, an EU defence union, EU defence procurement. This is wrong, you know. We do not want, I mean, only France and Britain really spend a lot of money on defence in the whole of the EU. And, you know, our industry, our defence industry is very important to our country. We do not want to be sending parts of it off to Slovakia or the Czech Republic, or, you know, we want to ensure that our defence industry is healthy and globalised and not tied into a whole EU plan. I'm worried that NATO is being undermined by the EU defence union, the EU army. We're talking about a lot of the same assets, military assets, ships or brigades or whatever, being reused in a different way. But I'm afraid the reality is that Germany doesn't pay even 2% into the NATO defence budget. We need to ensure that you know, we bolster NATO, not undermine it and duplicate it. It's all about duplicating the EU, and 70% of NATO's operational funding comes from the United States.